Willkommen bei der DGAP. Sie sind hier beim Webinar von InFoEx, dem International Forum for Expert Exchange on Countering Islamist Extremism, der Deutschen Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik. Das Thema heute ist Deradicalization, Work and Recidivism, also Deradikalisierung und Rückfälligkeit. Before we start, I would like to give the floor to my dear colleague Sofia Koller, who is a research fellow on counterterrorism and the prevention of violent extremism here at DGAP, and she's also the project leader of this project, InFoEx. Sofia, you have the floor.
Thanks, Alexander. Yeah, good afternoon also to everyone from my part. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this first public discussion on deradicalization, work and recidivism as part of, as Alexander mentioned, InFoEx, standing for International Forum for Expert Exchange on Countering Islamist Extremism. First, I want to point out that this event is not held under the Chatham House rule, but it will be recorded. Actually, it is already recorded. It already starts it. And we will publish the recording afterwards. You will also get an email. Before we turn to the actual topic of this event, allow me to briefly introduce InFoEx to you and also give some information on the context of this event. So almost exactly 2 years ago, we established InFoEx in cooperation with the German Federal Office for Migration and Refugee and its network of civil society and government partners. The project is funded by Germany's National Program to Prevent Islamist Extremism by the Ministry of the Interior for Building and Community. This means that InFoEx is actually part of a larger effort on this topic. For example, in the past years, several research fellows have started to work at local advice centers and research institutions all over Germany. And I am actually one of these research fellows. And in that way, we are contributing to improve knowledge exchange between practice and research on tertiary prevention. InFoEx has the objective to bring actors from practice, government, and research who are working on tertiary prevention of violent extremism together to identify, discuss, and communicate challenges and good practices on these issues. And just to make very sure that we are on the same page, in the context of InFoEx, we understand tertiary prevention as all efforts to disengage, deradicalize, decriminalize, and rehabilitate violent extremism in a society and prison settings. So the role of DGAP is not only to provide a platform for knowledge exchange between German stakeholders, but specifically to bring in an international expertise, and also based on the needs of the InFoEx members themselves. To achieve this objective, we have been organizing 6 international workshops over the past 2 years to collect inspiring and good practices from experts working in Germany and abroad. And we're also now about to publish our 4th issue paper to present the outcomes of these discussions in English and in German. You can find them on our website. The topics that we covered were always selected by the network themselves to ensure that they're really relevant to the network. And they included issues such as psychological factors in mental health issues, evaluation of tertiary PVE programs, questions related to the reintegration of returnees from Syria and Iraq, and risk assessment. This public discussion today will focus on the topic of our latest workshop in May on deradicalization, work and recidivism. With participants from Germany, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, we discussed the status quo of research on recidivism and some experiences from praxis. So I would like now to share with you 3 aspects of the topics that were discussed during the workshops. First, regarding research. So in recent years, research, for example, by our speaker, Andrew Solke, and also by Thomas Renard from the Egmont Institute in Belgium, this research indicates that terrorist reoffending rates might actually be consistently lower than might have been expected or perceived in public. At the same time, much more research needs to be done. And in this context, it's also important to mention that there is still a lack of clarity on what recidivism actually is, which makes comparing research really difficult. So is it about rearresting? Is it about reincarceration? Is it about reconviction? Or re-engagement of offenders in violent extremism? So what are we actually talking about? Second point regarding practice. So at the workshop, some practitioners and counselors mentioned that in prison, getting access to a client so to be able to engage in discussions and building trust, can be actually easier than working with individuals outside prison. However, only after release, it becomes really clear how the client has actually developed. So when people come out of prison, the default is to return to their old social relationships. So it's really important to try help them build a new network. And one challenge seems to be ensuring a continuous process of counseling in prison to the period just before release and after release. And at the same time, some practitioners report that there are actually very few cases of extremist actors actively de-radicalizing former offenders, meaning that, according to some, a good practice might just be to prepare the client, assuming that they will be approached again at some point by extremists. Third and last point regarding policy. So the question is also in this aspect, how can an overreaction on this issue be avoided? Because the stated objective of terrorism is to provoke fear and panic. So instead of giving this kind of response, we should rather focus on developing nuanced explanations and policy responses based on scientific evidence. However, there is still missing evidence on the effectiveness, for example, of intervention methodologies. So it will thus be important to really discuss existing evidence and experiences with a larger public audience to improve the understanding on de-radicalization work and recidivism. Having said that, this is the reason why we decided to bring some of our workshop speakers, so Gabby, Samit, and Andrew, together once more to discuss these aspects, not only with our InFoEx network partners, but also with you, other interested stakeholders. And without further ado, I'm now looking very much forward to an interesting discussion with you, and I hand back to my colleague, Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, for setting the stage. Perfect. Now, let me please start by introducing our exciting panel. We have three renowned experts from the field of research and practice. I'll introduce all three of you, and then we dive right into a discussion. Andrew Silke is a professor of terrorism, risk, and resilience at Cranfield University. He has a background in criminology and forensic psychology and has worked both in academia and for the government. He works with practitioners to develop state-of-the-art knowledge to prevent and counter radicalization to violent extremism. Our second speaker today, or panelist, better word, is Gabi. Gabi Thiessen is an experienced Dutch forensic psychologist and researcher and a PhD student, specialized in radicalization and terrorism, and she's also working in a Dutch prison facility in the very high security Supermax terrorist department. Our third speaker, Samit Air, studied Islamic theology and works as a de-radicalization counselor at the Violence Prevention Network in Germany. He's also a PhD student, and his research focuses on radicalization in German prisons. What's then the consequence out of this? Should we therefore focus not so much on the matter because it's not a big deal, or what are any lessons that you can maybe already draw from or insights?
Yeah, we often see like the whole thing is the chance that a terrorist will reoffend in terroristic acts is very low. But if they do, the impact of the crime is often very big. So the reoffenders in the Netherlands were all people who were in the news, I think, this week because of they planned a very big terroristic act in the Netherlands. So it's always a very high impact crime. And what we saw in the reoffenders for terrorists is that they had a thing in common, which was that they were convicted previously for an attempted travel to Syria. And they had a very high feeling of failure. So they didn't make it to Syria, while their mission in life was to fight the jihad in Syria. So they wanted to rectify their failure and still accomplish their mission.
Right.
And when they couldn't do it in Syria because the ISIS caliphate was collapsed, then they thought we have to do it in the Netherlands. And I think one of the most important insights we had in our Dutch system is that it is very important to involve the system and the family. If it's a positive system, that we need to involve them, because nobody after prison is waiting for a terroristic offender to get him as a neighbor or an employee. So the only people they have in life after prison time is their family. So
Perfect.
this was a very important insight we got for the last years.
Yeah, and we'll discuss that later on, reintegration into where or what, right? Like the environment that usually plays a role in the radicalization process. It's a complex system, maybe a family, maybe a group, a community, and all that. Before we do that though, let's bring in Samet, and I'm going to switch into German. You don't have to do anything.
Und das bedeutet, dass die Gespräche dann auch nach 4, 5 Monaten dann auch erst detaillierter bzw. intensiver werden. Das heißt, dass in den ersten 4, 5 Monaten wir vorerst einfach mal über Gott und die Welt sprechen, über allgemeine Themen sprechen, über aktuelle Themen sprechen und erst dann nach 4, 5 Monaten, wo auch unser Klient das Gefühl bekommt, hey, das sind Leute, die interessieren sich für mich, das sind Leute, die wollen mir helfen. Erst dann öffnen sie sich. Es kann aber auch sein, dass dieser Prozess auch erst nach 2 Jahren beginnt, tatsächlich. Aber in der Regel ist die Erfahrung so im Durchschnitt immer 6 bis 9 Monate und da geht es dann auch meistens los. Und das ist dann auch so, dass das Ganze dann nicht irgendwie plötzlich in einem Treffen beginnt, sondern beispielsweise während einer Autofahrt, wo wir gemeinsam zu einem Termin gehen wollen, er dann plötzlich loslegt und 2 Stunden lang durchredet, was ihm beispielsweise in Syrien widerfahren ist und so weiter. Und da merke ich, aha, wir kommen jetzt sehr gut an, es ist das Gefühl da, dass er uns vertrauen kann und dann kann ich eigentlich sagen, dass die eigentliche Arbeit eben auch dann beginnt. Hierfür ist es halt wichtig, natürlich auch bestimmte Vorgehensweisen zu haben. Wir haben die vor allem beispielsweise in dem Konzept der Verantwortungspädagogik. Das ist eben ein Konzept von VPN, von meinem Arbeitgeber und eben auch eben in der Biografiearbeit. Und da ist es wichtig, in dieser Biografie Lücken sich anzuschauen, also Lücken zu erfahren, die falsch gelaufen sind, die problematisch waren und in der Beratungsarbeit versuchen, so gut es geht, diese Lücken zu schließen. Konkretes Beispiel vielleicht, wenn jetzt beispielsweise wir einen Ausreise haben, der jetzt wieder zurückgekehrt ist, der auf Action und Abenteuer steht, wenn ich das so sagen darf, dem biete ich keinen Kuchen und keinen Tee an und sage so, jetzt führen wir die Beratungsarbeit in einem Café durch, sondern vielmehr gucke ich, dass das Setting auch dementsprechend passt, also kein langweiliges Setting ist und dementsprechend dann auch die Person besser erreichen kann.
Sehr spannend, sehr praxisorientiert. Und das Thema Rückfälligkeit, wie erleben Sie das in Ihrer täglichen Arbeit?
Wir machen das in der Regel so, dass wir tatsächlich Prozesse oder Fälle nicht abschließen. Wir tun nur die Intensivität der Fälle dann auch etwas verringern. Das heißt, wenn wir nach der Entlassung in den ersten 6 Monaten oder auch in den ersten 1, 2 Jahren dann sehr intensiv an dem Fall dran sind, das intensiv kann in den ersten Wochen beispielsweise 4-mal in der Woche bedeuten, teils auch am Wochenende, je nachdem, wie es dann ist. Und dann eben diese Intensivität nach 1, 2 Jahren zeitgleich eben auch mit der eigenständigen, also mit dem Selbstbewusstsein, mit der eigenständigen Lebensführung des Falles oder des Klienten dann auch verringern und dementsprechend dann darauf bedacht sind, weiterhin das Gefühl zu geben, dass wir da sind, dass wir helfen. Dementsprechend sagen wir jetzt auch nicht unbedingt, der Fall ist jetzt nach 2 Jahren abgeschlossen und kann jetzt eben sein Leben ganz normal durchführen, dass wir dann trotzdem, auch wenn wir meinen, es ist ein Deradikalisierungsfall, trotzdem das Gefühl geben, hier hast du meine Handynummer, auch wenn du jetzt keine Auflagen hast, ruf mich an, wenn du mich brauchst. Und dementsprechend eben auch gucken, dass wir eben möglichst langfristig dafür sorgen, dass eben ja, es zu keiner Rückfälligkeit kommt.
Gibt es da Wettbewerb von der anderen Seite? Gibt es das, was Sofia vorhin angesprochen hat, Deradikalisierung, also wirklich gezielte Bestrebungen von Akteuren, die im deutschen Kontext als extremistisch einzustufen sind oder latent extremistisch, die Brüder und Schwestern zurückzuholen?
Ja, die gibt es in der Tat. Im Gefängnis ist es etwas schwieriger geworden mit der Zeit, weil jetzt eben auch Berater wie ich dann auch tätig sind, tagtäglich in den Gefängnissen unterwegs sind und auch Fortbildungsangebote an Bedienstete gemacht werden, sodass sie eben auch gewisse Sensibilität auch bekommen haben. Das bedeutet aber nicht, dass eben die Radikalisierung oder die Deradikalisierung komplett abgeschlossen ist. Die kann weiterhin stattfinden, nämlich wenn, ich komme aus Niedersachsen, in den niedersächsischen Gefängnissen haben wir beispielsweise mindestens 3, 4 berühmte Fälle, die in den Medien bekannt sind. Wir haben einen Prediger, der weltweit bekannt ist, und das zu wissen, eben beispielsweise, wenn die Gefangenen das wissen, führt es dazu tatsächlich, dass das Thema weiterhin interessiert bleibt, dass sie weiterhin auf der Suche sind. Zudem habe ich auch noch gesehen, dass vor allem im Gefängnis 95%, also ohne wirklich zu übertreiben, 95% der Gefangene wissen, wo die nächste salafistische Moschee ist. Und dass diese salafistische Moschee eben Unterstützung, finanzielle, physische, psychische Unterstützung anbietet und dementsprechend wir dann auch darauf bedacht sind, darauf aufzupassen. Nach der Entlassung ist eben die direkte Ansprache teils auch da, indem man eben bereits im Gefängnis sagt, du kannst nach deiner Entlassung zu dieser Moschee, da bekommst du ganz gewiss eine Unterstützung, und das gibt nun mal einen Haftentlassenen ein sehr gutes Gefühl, dass er dann weiß, ich habe wenigstens jemand nach meiner Entlassung. Meistens ist es auch der Fall bei den Haftentlassenen, die keine familiäre Bindung haben, keine soziale Bindung haben. Und das haben viele leider nach 4, 5 Jahren Entlassung, Gefängniserfahrung. Und dementsprechend ist dieses Gefühl zu wissen, ich kann dahin, auch eine große Gefahr für uns, also ein Alarmsignal. Sonst ist es tatsächlich ganz typisch, leider auch in den sozialen Medien, dass dort extrem viel Arbeit geleistet wird. Wir haben bei 2, 3 Fällen auch, dass sie explizit per Brief angeschrieben worden sind und auch dort Adresse gegeben wurde. Du kannst uns nach deiner Entlassung, also es war dann auch so kurz vor der Entlassung des Gefangenen, du kannst uns hier in dieser Adresse erreichen. Eben auch dort eben tatsächlich diese direkte Arbeit, explizite Arbeit gemacht wird.
Und Sie wissen das, weil Ihre Klienten Ihnen das sagen? Und was machen Sie dann? Führen Sie dann auch ein Beratungsgespräch dahingehend?
Genau, dass wir tatsächlich eigentlich schon im Voraus schon eben sie da sensibilisieren, weil wir die Erfahrung schon öfters gemacht haben. Aber auch dann, kommen die meisten dann auch auf uns zu, weil die dann sagen, du, ich wurde hier direkt angeschrieben, wie soll ich damit umgehen, was soll ich machen und so weiter, dass wir dann auch dementsprechend dann dran sind.
And we often think it's very important to give them a meaningful life afterwards. And this is also the most difficult part because they don't get a license of good behavior. A lot of people who had a higher degree of education were more in a social thing, for example, psychologists, social workers, nurses. We had a lot of these type of prisoners. And when they were released from prison, they were not able anymore to do their jobs as they did before they went into prison. And it's very important to give them a meaningful life because this is also often the drive to do some terroristic acts, that they want to be something. So this is, I think, on one hand a challenge, and on the other hand it's good to know and to invest in this.
Great. And there were 2 questions now already that might fit into exactly what you were saying. In the Dutch situation, are prisoners isolated in any way? What's the prison regime? Is there in the supermax that you're working with, or in that kind of prison in the Netherlands? What's your approach? Because as we know, in Europe, there are different approaches on how to deal with terrorist-related offenders. And the second one, is there a connection between the age of the offenders and the recidivism rate, since it is usually the case the older people get, the less often do they commit crimes. So is there something that we can learn from an age difference or the length of incarceration and this recidivism risk?
Yeah, according to the first question, in the Netherlands, there was the first terrorists who came in the Netherlands were in 2004 with the killing of Theo van Gogh, who was a cynicist in the Netherlands. 1 year after a group of people was arrested for this crime, they saw that these people recruited other Muslim inmates, and our government made another choice in this. So they said, like, we don't have to place them in ordinary prisons, but we have to place them together. So since 2005, we have a concentration policy, and every person who is suspected or convicted for a terroristic crime is placed in this terrorism wing. And so they are all placed together. They are not isolated. They are placed in very small groups with a lot of security measures. So we have a lot of staff members. We have a group of 5 prisoners, always with 2 guards. So they are highly visible. And we record, for example, all the visits, all the contacts they have with the outside world by phone or by letter. We check everything. And there are always positive and negative consequences of this regime. So there was also a lot of criticism, for example, from Amnesty International, who said, like, you cannot place prisoners by their suspicion or their crime. You have to place them when people are psychiatric ill. We place them in special departments. When they are very dangerous, we place them in special departments. But you cannot only select on the basis of crime. So there's a lot of criticism and a lot of positive things. So yeah, I think that's the first question. And the other thing, yeah, the link between age and recidivism, we don't see that much. We had only 4 reoffenders in terroristic acts, so we can also not draw very harsh conclusions from that. All were young people who stayed in prison for 2 months till 40 months. So the sentences were not that long in these cases. And of course, we think when people get older, they will reoffend less, but still, yeah, we don't know because we don't have any data from that. And on the other hand, we have some older people in prison, but they are serving a very long sentence because they did very bad thing. We have one guy who, now we have 2 guys who have a lifelong sentence. So yeah, they cannot reoffend anymore, or they had to do it in prison, but yeah. So we don't know yet that much about age and reoffending in the Netherlands.
Regarding what Samet mentioned, that there are activities by outside actors that are under surveillance by security agencies, mosques, communities, organizations, individuals, of trying to re-recruit or de-radicalize. Is there something that you can share with us from the Netherlands?
Yeah, we also have some organization who is supporting terrorist offenders in prison. We are worried a lot about this organization because there are also ex-prisoners in this organization who were previously convicted or suspected for terrorist crimes. So sometimes they send money, sometimes they send a letter. So we also have this phenomenon in the Netherlands. We are worried about it, but I think because in prison we record all the letters and everything which is sent in and out, and it's also written in their reports. So it's also sent to court or to the police, and they know that. So we have prisoners who distance themselves from this organization, not because they don't want their information or their letters, but just because they know we write it down and it can be used against them. So yeah, we also have this and we are worried about it.
And do you have organizations and experts like Summit Air in a Dutch context? Like, is there a process from people in prison that you work with once they leave? Do they cooperate with organizations once they're already in prison and have a smooth transition, or is there a handover process? How does that work?
Yeah, we have the probation, who is already started in prison and go with the prisoner also outside. But we also have NGOs, imams, people who are more social workers, psychologists who can come in prison, but also follow a prisoner outside. And inside we use often our own imams who are special educated. But they are not going outside, but the NGOs and the probation is, and also the local authorities. So often there is a mentor type of guy from the local authorities who is coming in prison and of course also after prison there for the prisoner.
Die Rolle von im Englischen Communities, Religionsgemeinschaften oder Vereine in dem Bereich, welche Rolle spielen die denn? Also Sie haben das gerade ein bisschen angesprochen, aber ist das für Sie, sind das strukturelle Partner, sind das punktuelle Partner, wie gehen Sie damit um oder müsste da mehr passieren? Outreach, Kooperation, Finanzierung?
Definitiv. Also das ist auch gerade ein Thema in meiner Doktorarbeit, nämlich, dass ich in den ganzen Interviews, die ich mit den Gefangenen oder mit den Haftentlassenen geführt habe, habe ich gesehen, dass sie eigentlich in diese Moscheegemeinden gehen wollen, also diese nicht-salafistischen, so betitel ich die jetzt mal, in die nicht-salafistischen Moscheegemeinden gehen wollen, aber dort keine Anknüpfpunkte haben. Das heißt, sie haben keinen direkten Ansprechpartner, wie es in der salafistischen Moschee der Fall ist. Beispielsweise in der salafistischen Moschee gibt es Ansprechpartner, der wirklich für Haftentlassene zuständig ist. Wir haben Ansprechpartner dort, oder Sie haben Ansprechpartner dort in der Moschee, die für Fußballspieler zuständig sind, etc. etc. Und wenn man dann in eine nicht-salafistische Moschee geht, hat man dort überhaupt keinen Ansprechpartner. Das sind eher ältere Herren, die in diese Moschee gehen, die auch noch kein Deutsch können. Also in einer arabischen Moschee sprechen sie kein Deutsch, sondern nur Arabisch. In der türkischen Moschee sprechen sie kein Arabisch oder kein Deutsch, sondern nur Türkisch. Und dementsprechend, auch wenn die Haftentlassenen in den ersten Wochen in diese Moscheen gehen, bekommen sie dort keine Ansprechpartner oder eben keinen Halt, keine Unterstützung, sodass sie dann eben andere Alternativen, eben dann diese salafistischen Moscheen aufsuchen. Dementsprechend ist auch eine Handlungsempfehlung, die ich meiner Doktorarbeit eben auch gebe, die Moscheegemeinden, auch wie schwer tatsächlich die Kooperation mit diesen Moscheegemeinden sein mag, das muss man auch sagen, es ist nicht einfach, mit einer Moscheegemeinde zu kooperieren, trotzdem in diese lokalen Netzwerke eingebunden werden müssen, um eben mit ihnen auch gemeinsam zu arbeiten. Denn wenn in diesen lokalen Netzwerken nur die Flüchtlingshilfe, die Bewährungshilfe oder aber auch die lokale Polizeidienststelle ist, da ist es schwierig, eben diesen Menschen zu helfen. Es müssen eben auch Partner mit dabei sein, die mögliche Orte darstellen können, wo die Haftentlassenen auch hingehen. Zur Polizei, zu der Bewährungshilfe müssen sie ja, ist dann auch nur einmal im Monat in der Regel. Also da ist auch meine Erfahrung, da ist den meisten auch nur wirklich eine Stunde hingehen, weil sie das müssen. Und dementsprechend auch hier, wir sehen, dass allein die Arbeit der Bewährungshilfe auch nicht ausreicht. Dementsprechend wir lokale Partner brauchen, die als mögliche Orte dargestellt werden, wo die Haftentlassenen hin können.
Well, you know, it's a good point, and I think one of the big challenges we have in this area is the issue about reintegration. How do we reintegrate prisoners after their release, and what kind of, if you want, support can be provided to them at that time? And I think certainly in my experiences, a lot of the released prisoners have very much the same types of problems that other released prisoners have. But because of the terrorism connection, some of it is heightened and life is even more difficult for them. And I think there's an awful lot to be said for having a support framework there that assists with reintegration. So it assists with jobs, it assists with education, it assists with re-establishing a life that's away from extremism and that's away from the terrorist group, and provide support for that. Now, the challenge you have is that for many governments is that it's not a popular policy to introduce that type of support for former terrorist prisoners. because it's seen as being, you know, pandering to them or something like that. And so the easiest sell for a government is typically tough measures, more punitive measures. And if we look at the UK approach at the moment, it's along those lines. So it's along the lines of longer sentences, keep them in prison for longer. And it's not really at the moment around, you know, talking in terms of, you know, post-release reintegration, rehabilitation, and support like that. So I think that is a challenge, and that is something that we would benefit more from. We don't, I think, you know, researcher calls for more research is kind of, you know, the standard refrain. But I mean, one of the things we don't know enough about at the moment are the recidivists. You know, the guys who are released and then re-engage. What happened there? I'm particularly interested with the attack in last year, because he was out for a year before he carried out his attack. And Thomas Renard's very interesting work on the Belgian case suggested that most of the released prisoners who do re-engage in terrorism do so within the first 9 months of their release. And I think one of the interesting questions we have is what is happening with these people who do re-engage, and particularly after a longer period of time. Was he initially okay and then things went wrong? And if they did go wrong, how did that happen? And were there ways in which that could have been prevented? And I think there's a lot of questions here that we don't have the answers to at the moment, but it would be possible to get a lot of those answers going forward. You know, it is something we can do.
Great, very helpful. Now, unfortunately, the UK, Andrew, has a rich history of dealing with domestic terrorism, the Northern Ireland conflict. Are there any lessons from that period of time of rehabilitation, reintegration, the role of communities that Samet mentioned and we discussed? Is there anything you can share with us?
Well, I think it's important to highlight Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland presents a very different picture to the rest of the UK in terms of this experience. So when we're talking about things like MAPA and the interventions in prison and a lot of, you know, psychologists working with prisoners and all the rest of that applies to England and Wales and Scotland, and it doesn't apply to Northern Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, the paramilitary affiliated prisoners behave and operate in a very different way compared to, let's say, Islamist-inspired prisoners do in English jails. Now, one of the challenges you have in Northern Ireland as well is the degree of community support for the terrorists. When they're released, they certainly, you know, previously, you know, prior to the peace process, they were released into a community that was very supportive of the fact of their offending, and you know, what you had was a strong community and usually family network around them that was quite supportive and tolerant of it. And even today, if we look at the, you know, dissident Republicans and other groups, when prisoners are released, they're released into this type of environment, which is very supportive and tolerant in a way that we don't see, for example, a lot of the time when we look at Islamist-inspired or far-right prisoners when they're released. Now, the challenge again that you have is about how do you provide prisoners with a sense of meaning and with a support network when they are released. Now, one of the things, even in a Northern Ireland context, is that, you know, reconviction rates are still low for these prisoners, and this kind of takes us back into the, you know, to the questions about how are terrorists different. Now, in that case, it was kind of it was often seen that you had done your bit for the cause. And so you weren't going to be going back to prison again, having done your bit. Other reasons were you were compromised. The security forces knew who you were, and as a result, you weren't as useful as potentially somebody who was unknown. So there are a range of reasons to explain why people disengaged from activity, after the release from prison. But Northern Ireland, I think, is useful to consider because of the differences that it highlights to the experiences that we see with many other types of prisoners. And it also raises challenges for us in terms of what works. What do we think works with these prisoners in terms of both while they're in prison, but also once they're released? And that if we come up with a plan, and this plan works brilliantly for Islamist-inspired prisoners, but doesn't work for anybody else, then there's probably something very wrong with that. And you need, I think, a framework that can cross boundaries. And if it can't cross boundaries, then you need to look at the assumptions behind that framework.
Did you in your research see any connection between the length of the sentence served and the risk of recidivism or the recidivism rate? Any correlation at least?
It's, well, on the recidivism side at the moment, I don't think the data is fantastic around that. There is some interesting research from Israel which suggests that longer sentences are associated with lower levels of recidivism, and very, very short sentences are associated with higher rates of recidivism. Now, it remains to be seen how that pans out, but at one level, of course, if you're looking at factors like age and stuff like that, it can kind of make sense. But we'd like to see more research like that coming out, and if it is playing a role, to explore that in greater depth.
Thank you for that, Andrew. So before I go to Gabi, there's a question relating, are there similarities, differences with right-wing extremist offenders? And we were asking the same thing in our last workshop, and we invited Robert Orell, the founder of Exit Sweden, himself a former right-wing extremist who co-founded the Exit program for deradicalization and reintegration in Sweden. And actually, we realized that in the needs assessment, why people join extremist organizations, and also, so what are they looking for? What are the push and pull factors? And also what often leaves them then frustrated or motivates them to leave extremism. And then they face the same challenges everyone here described, reintegration into what? If you come from a community where this kind of ideology is quite present, if all your friends are from that background, if your family is absent or in support of what you did before. So we saw a lot of similarities in terms of the psychological structure, but not in terms of pathology. We did not discuss this in a mental illness context, but just what do humans need and what do they do to fulfill those needs. And that leads me, Gabi, to you as a psychologist. Is there something like a terrorist mind, a terrorist personality, something that you found, because Kirsten Zischka, who's also part of the InFoEx network, asked if recidivism, in some cases, if that is not related to mental illness or psychodynamic situation. Maybe you can comment on this part of the puzzle.
Yeah, what we see in our sample, and we had now, I think, 150 terrorist suspects or convicts in our terrorist wing since 2014. And we see that the psychopathology is way less than in ordinary prisoners, including also personality disorders. And it's more comparable to the normal Dutch population than it is to ordinary criminals. So we see that these people, when you look at the DSM-5 psychopathology indicators, are psychologically seen very healthy. So we don't really believe in a terrorist mind or whatsoever. But when you look more in depth, you see several specific risk factors and specific motivations for terrorist crime. And then you often see the feeling of disadvantage, the anger towards the state, the need for belonging, these types of more psychological phenomenon, but not like psychopathology in a more strict sense of the word.
In your daily work, how do you approach this then as a psychologist? What is then your psychological angle if mental illness is underrepresented in terms of other inmates?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is to really understand why these people are doing what they are doing. So we need to understand their radicalization narrative, as we call it. So why do these people do what they do? And this sounds very simple, but for example, when someone tries to prepare a very big terroristic act in the Netherlands, we need to understand why this guy is so angry or so full of hate towards the Netherlands and towards the people he would like to kill. And this is the thing I talk about with our prisoners. And it's not like a psychological thing that we do a lot of treatment. This is more a psychotherapy treatment, but we need to understand where this anger and this hate is coming from. And if you really understand this, then you can do something against it.
Okay.
But this is also very difficult because a lot of people circle around it. There is a lot of anger very far within them somewhere, but they don't want to talk about it very fast. So what we see, we need a lot of time also in prison to get a really trustful relationship so that they tell us really what they think.
Now, the reaction seemed to have been in the UK regarding these 2 terrorist attacks of released inmates to focus on the penal system, on the prison regime. Is there also a change in risk assessment in terms of used software or procedures? Is that also happening?
Yeah, risk assessment is a critical issue, and the UK, and particularly England and Wales, uses a risk assessment tool called ERG 22+ for assessing risk with terrorist prisoners. And many of the listeners will be familiar with a system called Vera 2R, which is used in many European countries. There's a lot of overlap between the two. Both of them have been developed over the last 10 years, and both of them are now used increasingly with these types of prisoners. And for my money, both of these are a big improvement on the risk assessment tools which were used before these came into operation, because these are bespoke tools designed for working with terrorist and extremist prisoners. How well do they work? Now, I think there's still a bit of a question mark over that. And I think we're still waiting for if you want, the impact studies to show, how good are these? For me, unquestionably, they are better than what was there before. There's no doubt about that. You look at the assessments carried out on the old tools compared to these, and for my money, these are much, much better. But how reliable are they? We're still unsure, and that's an area that needs more and more attention. I think we're getting it. Certainly in England and Wales, there is a lot of work at the moment to look into the reliability and validity of ERG 22+. There are a lot of studies taking place around Vera 2R as well, and that is to be welcomed. I think if you were to, the short answer is we're in a much better place today than we were 10 years ago, and I suspect in another 10 years we will have it advanced considerably again. But this is an absolutely crucial question. How well can we tell or assess an individual's level of dangerousness using the tools which are available to us?
Now, you mentioned effectiveness. And that's also, of course, a question that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room, as the Americans might say. That's the topic we all struggle with, right? How do we establish causality or contribution to causality? What's the status quo from your perspective as a leading researcher on the evaluation of impact and effectiveness of deradicalization programs that start in prison?
I mean, one of the problems we have, and it's a lovely problem to have, is this low level of reoffending, because it is very low. So how can you tell what's having an impact and what isn't having an impact? If the reoffending rate was higher, like we see with sex offenders, for example, where we're looking at 40 or 50% of them are going to be reconvicted within a few years of release, and then we introduce a program, we can see a change happening, because the level either comes down or it stays the same, or it goes up. But because we're dealing with a reoffending rate that might be as low as 3% in the UK for these type of prisoners, it's very difficult then to tell if a program is having a major difference. Right. And it's a bit like we're in very much a similar type of place as we are for the work around preventing radicalization. So because the number of people who become radicalized is so small to begin with, if you introduce a new program to try and prevent radicalization, it can be very, very difficult to measure, is that having a positive impact or not? And we're in a similar type of thing. I think in prison and for released prisoners, we need to have programs to work with them. And one of the problems we've had in the past is that we haven't had anything. There's been no program for terrorist or extremist prisoners, and these are being introduced and being established. And I think that is a positive. The next step is to do impact evaluations on, are these working? Now, I think anecdotally, there's a lot of evidence to suggest positive stories and positive trajectories as a result of many of these programs, but we need to kind of raise the evidence base higher. We need to kind of push the standards a bit more. And again, that's going to be one of the challenges we have over the coming 10 years.
That's a very good point. Are you aware of any evaluation that used a control group, a group that did not benefit from specific intervention support compared to the group that received the support and then analyzed changes in behavior?
Yeah, there have been some, surprisingly enough, and probably one of the best ones was actually focused in Sri Lanka, where it was working with former LTTE cadre members. And what you had there were that you had interventions which were focused on large numbers of prisoners, and then at one particular prison, they weren't able to run the interventions, so they were able to use that group as a control group for the rest. And what they found was that the interventions had a positive impact in terms of attitudes towards prison staff, attitudes towards the government, attitudes around disengagement. You could see changes in the prisoners who'd been through the programs versus those who hadn't had anything happen to them. So it does seem to have a positive impact, at least according to some measures that we can test.
Right, that's good news. Other news is what Thomas Renard highlighted in his research, because he looked back into the 90s in his terrorism research, I think, early 90s, and the work of de-radicalization projects and programs in prison and after prison only started 3 or 4 years ago, but people seem to de-radicalize and reintegrate anyway. Right, so this is really something we need to look into contributing factors in terms of causality and all that. So that's a very exciting topic regarding limiting the access of released offenders to communities, mosques that are being considered problematic. Is there, like Samit mentioned, the focus seems to be more on capacity building, I would say. What's the focus in the Netherlands here?
Yeah, in the Netherlands we have also some mosques who are like in the news with a lot of issues. But the whole issue is, of course, that you cannot forbid a lot for people. Sometimes they cannot go to some area in our country, or they cannot have contact with some other ex-prisoners or whatsoever. But it's only for a period of time in where they were sentenced, of course. So this is always a difficult thing. On the other hand, we always try to get people into contact with some NGO or with a mentor or with whatsoever, so that we can offer them another instrument or another thing where they can get their knowledge from. Because what we often see is that there are some prisoners who really want to get a lot of knowledge into the ideology, and then we try to offer them some good imam or some good something so
right.
that they can
what's good? What do you mean by good? Who makes that assessment?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a theologist, but we have some NGOs who work with some imams and with some theologists who can offer them some literature or who can offer them a lot of things. But in prison, we had a whole debate on Ibn Kathir. So there was some books of Ibn Kathir, and we thought it were good books, but then the policymakers thought it were bad books, and now we had a whole issue on it. So yeah, it's always the question what is good and what is wrong, but yeah.
And following up on the discussion on impact and the evaluation, what's the situation in the Netherlands regarding that?
Yeah, they are very bad. So we do a lot of treatments and a lot of interventions, but they are evaluated sometimes by the people who are giving the interventions. So that's an issue. And on the other hand, sometimes they say like it's very successful because the recidivism rates are very low. But then I think, yeah, but all the recidivism rates are low in every country, nevertheless, which interventions or treatments we do. So I think the whole question will always be, is there a possibility that we can lower the recidivism rates? Because, yeah, I don't know if you can drop it to 0%.
So we have some more time. I would like, Gabi, since we're talking, is there anything you would like to add or ask Andrew or Samet?
No, yeah, I would be very interested in the more ideological approach of this whole issue. We in the Netherlands have a problem with it because we have our prison imams, but they are very polite and very gentle and are very liberal Sunnism Muslims. And we have the issue that the more radical prisoners say, like, you're not an imam, you're not a Muslim at all, so I don't go to you, I don't listen to you. So we have an issue in finding more charismatic leader type of imams who can inspire our prisoners. So I am very curious about how this is going into Germany, but also in Britain.
Yeah, that actually would have been my follow-up question that I'm now going to ask Samet Ehre. Samet, wie geht das mit der Autorität? Also das ist auch eine Frage, die vorhin noch gestellt wurde. Es reicht ja nicht, dass jemand vorbeikommt, der was vom Koran erzählt. Wenn zum Beispiel jemand sehr autoritätsorientiert ist und das auch Teil des Radikalisierungspfades war, die Suche nach Klarheit, Wahrheit, Autorität, Gewissheit. Wie geht ihr dann damit um, dass dann vielleicht jemand kommt, der erstmal gar nicht akzeptiert wird?
Also hier ist im Prinzip erstmal klar zu unterscheiden, nämlich zwischen islamistisch hochideologisierten Gefangenen und auch zwischen Gefangenen, die zwar auch islamistisch sind, aber auch nicht aufgrund der Ideologie, sondern vielmehr aufgrund eben von pädagogischen Faktoren. Bei eben denjenigen, die aufgrund von pädagogischen Faktoren oder biografischen Krisen etc. sich in der islamistischen Bewegung befinden, haben wir die Beobachtung gemacht, dass sie die Imame weiterhin als Autorität akzeptieren. Also Imame werden in der Regel auch in der islamischen Kultur gerne als Autoritätsperson gesehen. Also ich beispielsweise bin für meinen Schwiegervater eine Autoritätsperson, weil ich islamische Theologie studiert habe. Das heißt, wenn ich tatsächlich jetzt mal, ohne zu übertreiben, in das Zimmer eintrete, steht er auf. Ne? Ich denke mir so, warum machst du das denn? Aber es ist halt tatsächlich so, dass das in der islamischen Kultur stark verankert ist, dass man einfach Respekt gegenüber Menschen hat, die sich mit religiösen Themen beschäftigen oder auch das studiert haben. Und das ist bei den Imamen auch der Fall. Aber eben gerade bei den islamistischen Gefangenen ist es genau das Gegenteil, nämlich weil sie dann direkt als Ungläubige gesehen werden und dass sie als Menschen gesehen werden, die vom Staat geschickt werden oder die für den Staat, im Falle der türkischen Moscheen, für den Staat arbeiten und dementsprechend ist das auch schwierig. Da sind wir dann hauptsächlich gefragt als Violence Prevention Network, als Berater, nämlich, dass ich dann auch, also ich kenne mich sehr gut aus mit theologischen Themen und wenn mir dann auch jemand mit rezitierten koranischen Antworten oder Argumenten kommt, bekommt er auch von mir dementsprechend ein Argument oder auch Meinungen von Gelehrten aus dem 12., 13., 14. Jahrhundert. Das kann ich alles auswendig sagen. Das ist nun mal das, was ich studiert habe und das, wofür ich mich auch interessiere. Und wenn Sie das merken, dass wirklich ich das kann und ich auch Ahnung habe, dann nehmen Sie mich auch dann ernst. Wobei, hier muss man auch nochmal gucken, dass wir auch nicht wirklich, wie auch Gabi das erwähnt hat, nicht die Erwartung haben dürfen, dass wir aus solchen Menschen super Bürger machen, super integrierte Bürger. Ich sehe das beispielsweise als Erfolg, wenn im ersten Gespräch ein hochideologisierter Klient mir sagt, du bist ein Ungläubiger, weil dich der Staat hierhin schickt und nach dem vierten Gespräch sagt, du, ich würde dich jetzt doch nicht töten. Ne? Du bist eigentlich doch ein guter Mensch, zwar ein Ungläubiger, aber ich würde dich nicht töten. Das sehe ich beispielsweise als Erfolg. Dann denke ich, wow, okay, das heißt, immerhin würde er mich nicht töten, also wurde was Gutes da gemacht oder zumindest einige Schritte gemacht. Dementsprechend ist es auch da nochmal wichtig. Also das heißt, Islamismus oder islamistische Themen oder die Theologie in der Hinsicht spielen eine Rolle, zwar bei uns sind es also aktuell 44 Klienten, die wir haben, spielt nur bei 2 eine Rolle. Und da sehe ich dann auch, dass sie auch nicht so vertieft in dieser Thematik sind, sondern auch nur bestimmte Koranverse sind, die sie auswendig gelernt haben und mit mir dann darüber sprechen und ich in der Regel dann auch die Antwort habe. Und nochmal vielleicht ein letzter Satz. Und auch mein Ansatz hier niemals auch konfrontativ ist, sondern auch nochmal hier weiterhin wertschätzend. Das heißt, auch hier versuche ich Ihnen auch beizubringen, dass man auch über diese Themen auch diskutieren kann, ohne dem Gegenüber zu beleidigen oder als Ungläubiger abzustempeln. Also auch nochmal hier ein Lernprozess in der Hinsicht.
Also auch eine Unterscheidung zwischen Distanzierung und Deradikalisierung, die, glaube ich, generell ja auch relevant ist in dem Kontext. Dankeschön. Ich schlage vor, wir gehen jetzt in eine Art von Schlussrunde. Ich habe aber noch eine Schlussfrage, was Empfehlungen angeht. Gibt es Empfehlungen für Behörden und Politik? Wir versuchen ja schon auch so ein bisschen gute Praktiken und Gelerntes weiter zu kommunizieren. Also was würdest du denn sagen, sollte man jetzt mitgeben, Leuten, die in Entscheidungspositionen sind, über Veränderungen nachdenken, über Budgets verfügen? Was sollte verändert werden aus deiner Praxiserfahrung?
Also ich plädiere schon immer dafür, das habe ich auch in meiner Doktorarbeit auch hervorgehoben, lokale muslimische Gemeinden eben mit reinzunehmen in eben die Netzwerken, in die Arbeit. Das ist leider eben nicht der Fall. Auch wenn der Seelsorger im Prinzip eine ganz andere Aufgabe hat, kann er auch zur Prävention beitragen, indem er beispielsweise eher über aktuelle Themen spricht. Wenn jetzt irgendwo ein Attentat passiert und wir als Berater nicht vor Ort sein können, kann das der Seelsorger machen. Aber dafür brauchen auch Seelsorger eine professionelle Ausbildung. Übrigens, also in Deutschland haben die Seelsorger keine professionelle Ausbildung. Ein paar Wochen besuchen sie ein paar Wochen einige Fortbildungen und das war es dann auch. Ich beispielsweise habe islamische Theologie studiert, könnte eigentlich Imam werden, ohne irgendwelche Ausbildung. Und das ist nicht gut, ne? Das ist zu wenig. Da muss tatsächlich nochmal, wie wir auch in Deutschland das bei den Christen haben und bei den Juden haben, ein Rabbinerseminar, ein Priesterseminar auch nochmal bei den Muslimen eingeführt werden. Man kann es dann auch Imam-Seminar nennen. Das gibt es bis dato nicht. Das heißt, es ist tatsächlich eine Frage des Finanziellen, dass auch die Moscheegemeinden unterstützt werden müssen. Gelder werden zwar zur Verfügung gestellt, aber da haben wir dann das Problem, dass muslimische Gemeinden gar nicht wissen, wie man Förderanträge stellt. Also auch da kennen sie sich damit gar nicht aus, sodass sie einfach versuchen, das weiterhin ehrenamtlich zu machen oder mit geringen Spenden zu machen, was dann auch natürlich sehr gering gemacht wird, weil eben da auch nicht so viele Spendengelder zur Verfügung stehen. Das heißt, es muss professioneller werden, es muss mehr Unterstützung vom Staat bekommen werden und auch nicht nur für eine bestimmte Gemeinde, nur weil sie eben 900 Moscheegemeinden hat, sondern auch andere, kleinere muslimische Vereine. Also auch Vereine, die von mir aus 100 Mitglieder haben, aber auch Menschen haben, die eben hier gute Arbeit leisten können.
Super, sehr konkrete Vorschläge. Aber gleich auch als Nachfrage, wenn ich jetzt in einer Behörde sitze und kriege so einen Antrag, wer hilft mir denn zu entscheiden, ob das eine Organisation ist, die zu 100% auf der freiheitlich-demokratischen Grundordnung steht oder nicht doch irgendwelche anderen Hidden Agendas, also andere Ziele vielleicht verfolgt, wenn ich kein Expertin in dem Thema bin. Bietet ihr sowas
an? Da ist es, also vorerst gibt es jetzt fast jeder Polizeidienststelle, beim LKA, beim Verfassungsschutz auch Islamwissenschaftler, die dafür zuständig sind. Das gab es 5 Jahre nicht, sondern nur eben ganz vereinzelte. Aber jetzt fast jeder Ort in Deutschland hat jetzt auch mittlerweile einen Islamwissenschaftler, der für diese Fragen zuständig ist. Dann darüber hinaus eben nochmal, wie gesagt, dieser Netzwerkaustausch, ne, dass eben in diesen Netzwerken und auch nicht landesweite Netzwerken, sondern wie gesagt lokale Netzwerken, also auch in einer Stadt von 20.000 Einwohnern auch Netzwerke aufgebaut werden und diese Themen dann auch dort besprochen werden.
Super, vielen Dank dafür, Samit. Based on your work, based on the discussion for policymakers, I guess with a focus on the UK, but also if you can go beyond that, what would you like to share?
Well, I think probably the main thing is to in a sense, create more awareness that the problem isn't as severe as most people assume it is when they come to it first. That actually most of these people disengage. And that's the good news story. And I think that story gets lost, particularly in the aftermath of a bad attack. Mm-hmm. And the assumption is they're all dangerous. They're all going to stay dangerous, and there's very, very little we can do about it. And I think the message that's coming from the research and from the experience of practitioners is actually you can make a difference, and most of them do change, and they change for the better. And for me, if we can get that kind of more into the policy narrative, then we can start focusing attention where it's needed, rather than across the board blanket policy that assumes all of them are dangerous and all of them need extreme measures. And that's about education, and it's about engaging with the research, and it's about moving away from kind of more populist rhetoric, which unfortunately is what we get in the aftermath of an attack such as those that we saw recently in the UK.
Thank you. Gabi, what would be your recommendations for policymakers?
Yeah, I totally agree with Andrew. So I think more awareness of the real recidivism rates are very important. And also the whole anxiety, which is more a political thing, I think. So I thought maybe it's good to end with a quote, which we believe in. And it's a quote from Martin Luther King, who once said, like, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And I believe in this. So we need to connect, and we need to build up a relationship with trust. And we need to understand why these people are doing what they are doing. And I think that can change a little bit. And I think a lot of repression creates only more hate and more anger, and will make them only more dangerous. So I would like that people would better understand the figures. And I think it's important to get also more insights into the reoffenders, so that we understand the underlying mechanisms what make people reoffend.
Thank you so much. Now we have, I think, touched on many relevant topics. We took the liberty to go into some depth, and I'm very excited that this worked beautifully in terms of content. There were some issues at the beginning with the technical situation. Apologies again. It seems Andrew is suffering a lot from our technical issues. Again, that's why I say again, apologies, Andrew, and thank you for coming back anyways. I would now like to thank everyone from my side, but give the floor to Sofia, who has some important words to share with you as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so the important words are just also that I really enjoyed the discussion. I'm very happy that in the end we made it possible for having the translation issues fixed. And I really enjoy the format. I'm looking forward to having more of these kind of discussions. Of course, thanks a lot to all the speakers, to our participants, to Alexander for moderating again once an insightful event, to Miriam for supporting us as always beautifully, and of course to our both interpreters. That's quite a job, to have this kind of discussion interpreted. So thanks a lot. And to have a bit more of an insight, if you enjoyed this kind of format, if you would come back, and also more specifically, what would you like to be talking about in a possible next event? We are now sharing with you a very short survey. So please take 1-2 minutes to just have a look at it. Questions are both in English and in German. And it will be really, interesting for us to see what is interesting to you. There are no open questions possible in Zoom. So if you have another topic that would be relevant to you that you would like to discuss in that kind of format, public discussions within InfoEx, happy to reach out, send us an email, send it in the chat also if you want to. That would be really appreciated, and then we can see how we can take this further. Because as I mentioned, you're witnessing the first public InfoEx discussion, so it's like really a tryout. And as I mentioned, we will be sending around the publications that I mentioned within InfoEx after the discussion to all of you. The recording will also be sent out to you. It will be available publicly. And you are now also in contact, so we can send out a next invitation also to you. Of course, you can always unsubscribe, but we imagine that you're now interested in this kind of discussion and exchange.
thank you all also from my side. It was a great discussion, great questions, very lively, very informed. I'm looking forward to doing this again.